Okay, so welcome to our third lecture on the early Middle Ages. Today we talk about the Vikings. Now here's a map of Europe with looks like modern country boundaries on it. So please ignore that. Focus up into Scandinavia. By the 8th century, there are three main groups of Scandinavians: the Norse, the Swedes, and the Danes. They are, and to this day, we have Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. So here we see the nucleus of those modern countries. Now, Scandinavia has, it exists, it's there. There have been people living there for some time. All of them, they all speak languages that are related to each other. Okay, they are all North Germanic languages. But we'd only pay attention to groups like this when they start to have an impact on the rest of Europe. So that's just a feature of a course like this. We pay attention to the things that matter. It's not to say that there weren't people living there, okay? Okay. Starting in the late 8th century, all right? If you are minding your business, but if you live anywhere near the shore, chances are you're going to be visited by Vikings at some point. Over the horizon comes a boat. They come up onto shore. They come out of their boat. If you don't get out of the way, they'll grab you. They'll enslave you. They'll grab anything that is valuable and isn't nailed down. And if you offer any resistance, they'll kill you. And they might burn your village just for good measure. And so off they go. They can escape before any kind of resistance is organized. And so this kind of stinks, all right? No one knows when they'll strike next. And it's a time of uncertainty and a time of economic disruption when these Vikings come. And it's such a problem that there are certain prayers, we see it in the liturgy. There's an actual prayer that says, "From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord." Because, of course, when bad things happen and you're a monotheist, the only acceptable explanation is to say that God is punishing you for your sins. And so, dear Lord, please, whatever we did to deserve this, we're sorry. Just call it off. Now, there's a great deal of debate about why this starts to happen and why it starts to happen in the 8th century. In some ways, it's nothing new. People do slave raids all the time. The Irish did it as right after the Romans abandoned Britannia. But why does it happen from Scandinavia? People say various things. They say that these kingdoms were not stable, and if you want to make a bid for the kingship, you have to go out and attract and get booty, and then you can reward followers with that. So some people trace the raids to the internal politics of Scandinavia. Personally, I figure, why the raids? Why not? Okay? They were excellent sailors. They had excellent ship technology. They could go across open ocean. And they're pagans, all right? They are not Christian. And so they don't have scruples against attacking. When they die, they go to Valhalla, which is a big warrior hall, and they drink their mead, and they tell stories about the grand times when they were raiding and pillaging. All right? So their religion kind of justifies this lifestyle. And of course, they don't. What Willie Sutton in the 30s, they asked him, "Why do you rob banks?" And he says, "Well, that's where the money is." And that's the sort of thing that the Vikings do. They don't have scruples against attacking Christian churches or Christian monasteries. So that's, why not? They're rich. They're right there. And we're stronger than they are, so we're just going to take it. All right, so we have a good idea of what Viking ships looked like. All right, here are some reconstructed ones. So they have sails. They have oars that they can paddle up rivers if they need to. Um, we're all your archetypical Viking funeral consists of putting someone on one of these boats and setting it on fire and setting it out into the fjord. So the Vikings, they sure had style, eh? But other times they wouldn't set it on fire. They just haul it inland and bury the whole thing. So every now and then they uncover a buried ship. So that's how we know what Viking ships look like. Okay. Um, the first place to be hit was in Northumbria. Okay. Once Northumbria converts to Catholic Christianity, they go in for Christianity, and it's kind of like when Ireland went in for Christianity. Ireland goes on fire for Jesus. Northumberland gets on fire for Jesus. They're very keen on Christianity. A lot of monasteries were founded. A lot of monks produced a lot of beautiful manuscripts and so on. And one of the most famous Northumbrian monasteries was called Lindisfarne, which means Holy Island. It is an island off the coast of Northumbria. Actually, it's a tidal island. So at high tide, it's an island, but at low tide, you can walk out to it. And that's the thing about monasteries. Monks are supposed to be separate from the world. So a tidal island is an ideal place to put a monastery. Often you find monasteries up in mountains as well. But from a security point of view, it's not a good idea to put a monastery on a tidal island because you might as well be putting out a neon sign saying, attack me. And so in 793, the Vikings visited Lindisfarne. They raided it. They captured a bunch of monks and enslaved them, and they disappeared. And this was pretty shocking. Actually, one of the people at Charlemagne's court, his name was Alcuin. He was from York in England. He is part of the Carolingian Renaissance. And we have some of the letters that he wrote back to Lindisfarne, to the survivors, saying, basically, what sin did you commit that God is doing this to you? Well, that was bad enough, but more was to come. And anywhere on the coast of England or up a navigable river was hit. Basically, chances are you're going to be hit at some point in the early 9th century. But starting in 865, the Danes, they didn't go away. They came, they raided, they set up a winter camp. That winter camp turned permanent, and then they started bringing their wives and children over. So in 865, they started conquering England and settling people there. And so Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia were all conquered by the Danes. However, as you may remember, those three kingdoms were all Anglian kingdoms. To the south, of course, are the Saxon kingdoms, and they seem to have been made of sterner stuff, or at least King Alfred saw the writing on the wall and he knew what to do. So he knew it was only a matter of time before the Vikings attacked him. So he reorganized his kingdom and he trained his army, and such that in 878, when the Vikings came to visit him, he defeated them at Edington. So that is it's a very important battle in English history because basically Alfred saved Saxon England from the Vikings. Here's a map of Anglo-Saxon. As you can see there, Wessex has already absorbed Sussex and Essex. All right. Okay. And here are a couple of pictures. The King of East Anglia the Anglian kingdom of East Anglia. It was named Edmund. And Edmund, well, he failed. He failed to defend his kingdom from the Vikings, and they shot him full of arrows. But because he was Christian and the Vikings were pagan, he can go down as a great Christian martyr. And he becomes one of the more important saints, one of the patron saints of England, in fact. And he has a shrine in Suffolk called Bury St. Edmunds, and you can go there and see the remains of it. In Winchester, okay, you can see a statue of Alfred the Great. Winchester was the capital of the Kingdom of Wessex, and they're very proud of King Alfred in Wessex. They don't need to make him a saint, right? He actually succeeded at his job, so he gets the nickname the Great. And there's a 19th century statue of King Alfred there. Okay, so once King Alfred defeats the Vikings, there's a sort of a truce between the two. I mean, there's a kind of a boundary between that part of England ruled by Wessex and that part of England ruled by the Danes. It's called the Danelaw, the area where Danish law prevailed. And every dot on this map is interesting because it represents a place name of Scandinavian origin. All right, Anglo-Saxon is a Germanic language. Danish is also a Germanic language, but there's certain differences between the two. So anything that begins SK or SC, like Scarborough, that's a place name of Danish origin. If it were Anglo-Saxon, it would have been Sharborough. In fact, apparently skirt and shirt are the same word. Skirt is simply the Danish version of shirt, but they come to refer to different items of clothing. Anything with B on the end of it, like Rugby or Whitby or Appleby, that's also Danish origin. Eventually, of course, it's Wessex that defeats the Vikings, and that boundary there gets pushed further to the north. So the country of England as it exists today is the political descendant of Wessex. Okay, that's why there's no County Wessex, by the way. There is a County Kent, a County Sussex, County Cornwall, County Essex. Okay, but Wessex is the whole thing. And here is Ireland, all right? The Norse were the ones who visited Ireland, and it's the Norse who settled on the coast. And in fact, it is the Norse who taught the Irish about cities, okay? So Dublin, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick are all Viking foundations. That's where the Vikings settled and set up their cities, which were places for trade. Eventually, the Vikings do get absorbed into the native Irish population. And that happened in England too, right? Ultimately, the Danes forgot Danish and they started speaking English. Same thing in Ireland. So the Norse forget their language and they start speaking Irish. Okay. In France, they also attacked the coast of France. There is a part of France to the north of France and to the west of Paris there. It's called Normandy. Most Americans, when they hear Normandy, they think of the D-Day invasions in June of 1944. That's certainly a very important and significant event that took place there. But Normandy exists in the first place because it was a duchy that was in fact created for the Northmen. That's why it's called the Normandy. It was a little deal that Charles the Simple cooked up with Rollo. Okay, and Charles, I don't think Charles deserves his nickname, frankly. He wasn't so simple. This was a very clever thing to do. Basically, he said, Rollo, stop attacking us. We'll give you a patch of land for yours to call your own. I'll elevate it to the status of a duchy. You'll be the Duke of Normandy, and you will owe allegiance to me as the King of France. And if you convert to Christianity, that'd be great. And so Rollo took the deal. Rollo, basically, the Danes were domesticated in Normandy, and they stopped attacking, and within a generation, they're all speaking French. And so there's, on the left, a map of the position of Normandy in France, and then on the right is a map of where the Danish people settled. So around Cherbourg, Caen, et Rouen. Okay, Russia, believe it or not, is also, there's a close connection between the Vikings and Russia. It's not the Norse or the Danes, but the Swedes who tended to travel up the rivers of Russia. It is the Swedes who founded certain cities in Russia, including one called Novgorod and another one called Kiev, which, if you know geography, this is the capital of the modern country of Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is on the Black Sea, and since it is on the Black Sea, it was only a matter of time before these Swedes had diplomatic relations with Constantinople. And what happened was that it was sort of the same thing that happened between Rollo and Charles the Simple. The emperor, Basil the Bulgar Slayer, married his sister Anne to Vladimir of Kiev. Okay? And that was cemented a diplomatic alliance. The price of this marriage was that Vladimir would convert to Christianity, but of course this is Orthodox Christianity, and that happened in 988. And so the picture's there. On the one hand, Vladimir of Kiev, and on the other, an icon of Basil the Bulgar Slayer. So that is how Russia becomes Orthodox, as the result of this diplomatic alliance between Vladimir and Basil. It's important to realize that, again, the Swedes also went native. The Swedes were absorbed into the local Slavic populations, and they forgot their Swedish after a while. The other thing, too, is that Russia may have been founded around Kiev, but later on the whole state migrates to the north around the area that is now Moscow. And that's why Kiev is not in Russia anymore. Okay, but even more interesting are the Viking explorations to the west. Okay. Everywhere the Vikings settled, they went native. They were absorbed into the local population. I guess it's a question of numbers, or maybe it's a question of, I don't know, just maybe there's an inherent weakness in their language. Who knows? But in Iceland, that's not the case. If you go to Iceland today, they speak Icelandic, which is pretty close to Old Norse. Now, why do the Icelanders not get absorbed into the local population? Well, essentially, there's no local population to get absorbed into. All right? So the Vikings sail to the west. They discover Iceland, there's no one living there, so they settled it. And since there's no foreign influence, their language is really quite close to Old Norse. But as you can see on the map there, they go even further west and they settle in Greenland. And here's a map of the two Viking settlements in Greenland, the western and the eastern settlement. Eventually they do convert to Christianity, so they build churches, and if you go to Greenland, you can see the remains of a Viking church. Eventually, they abandoned Greenland. Although Greenland is still possessed by Denmark, all right, but the Europeans abandoned it in the late 15th century, largely as the result of climate change. The Earth just got a lot colder, which meant that you couldn't farm in Greenland anymore. All right. The Vikings love to sit around the campfire, hear stories of mighty warriors and brave deeds. And there are professional bards who specialize in telling these stories. And eventually they're written down. They're called sagas, and we have any number of Viking sagas that you can read, and they're great historical sources. And some of these sagas speak about a voyage to Vinland. Okay? Vinland meaning wineland, because it is a place where wild grapes grew. And it starts out in Greenland, and they go sort of down the coast. They visit a place called Helluland, another place called Markland, and eventually they get to Vinland, where wild grapes grew. And they ran into the locals, whom they called Skraelings. Relations very quickly went south, and so the Vikings abandoned Vinland. And so it's just like with Schliemann and Troy, right? Does this refer to something real, or is it just a story that they made up? All right. And so for a while, it was kind of like, archaeologists would sort of go up and down the east coast of Canada trying to discover evidence of Vinland. Well, in the 1960s, they did discover, well, they didn't discover Vinland, but they did discover irrefutable evidence that Vikings had indeed made it to the New World, quite a long time before Columbus. And this was a Norwegian husband and wife team, and they discovered irrefutable evidence of Viking settlement on the very northern tip of the island of Newfoundland, which, as you can see on the map, is designated Lonesome Meadows. And they dug up, the post holes in the ground were, it was just like the houses that were discovered in Greenland. And there was evidence of weaving. But most important of all, there was evidence of iron smelting. No natives at the time had that technology. So it's pretty apparent that the Vikings had in fact made it to northern Newfoundland. Now, as it turns out, this was not actually Vinland. Wild grapes never grew in northern Newfoundland. Instead, what they reckon is that Lonesome Meadows was a kind of base camp, that they may have stayed there over the winter, that Vinland was further south, probably in New Brunswick or maybe in Maine. But it is very interesting that the Vikings managed to make it to the New World 500 years before Columbus. And there you see, if you go to Lonesome Meadows today, you can see this Parks Canada has reconstructed the Viking settlements, and so you can have a look at what it might have looked like with the turf roof. Okay, now, it seems that everyone loves Vikings. All right, Vikings are always popular. On the left there, of course, is a guy who dresses up like a Viking for Minnesota Vikings games. In the top center there, that's Hagar the Horrible, who was It used to be when people got the newspaper, there was always a page of cartoons, a page of funnies, and you'd read, Family Circus and For Better or For Worse and Dilbert. There was another comic called Hagar the Horrible, and that was everyone's favorite Viking. Locally, Barry College, their mascot are the Vikings. And then at the bottom there, you've got the Capital One Vikings, right? There was a series of ads featuring Vikings. The thing that all of these depictions of Vikings have in common, of course, are helmets with horns. That's the instant signifier of a Viking, with a helmet with horns on it. As I say, they sure have style. This is the thing about Vikings, they're like Caribbean pirates, the Hells Angels, or the Mafia. All right? You definitely don't want to mess with them, but there's a certain romance to them. There's a certain outsider status to them, and they live by their own code, and they're inspiring for that reason. And yeah, the idea is that they have style, right? Setting fire to a ship in a fjord, or wearing those awesome helmets with horns. And so lots of people will name sports teams after the Vikings. You don't get anyone named, the Angles or the Franks or anything like that. But the Vikings, yeah, people like the Vikings. And here's a recent show that was shown on the History Channel, simply called Vikings. I guess this is a little bit more historically accurate. These people didn't get horns, but they were still pretty badass. But as you can see from what he's carrying, eventually these Vikings do convert to Christianity. And then finally, here's a bit of roadside Americana. If you go to Alexandria, Minnesota, you can see a 30-foot tall fiberglass statue of Big Ole the Viking. This guy does not have horns on his helmet. He has wings on his helmet. And why is Alexandria claiming to be the birthplace of America? Well, in the late 19th century, someone dug up the Kensington runestone, and that is depicted on the right. The Kensington runestone was, a stone with the particular Scandinavian script inscribed on it. Some farmer dug it up in his field. And that's like, wow, so the Vikings got here. They got all the way to Minnesota. Turns out the whole thing was a hoax. The farmer himself carved it and then buried it and discovered it a couple of years later. But that doesn't prevent the Vikings, Alexandria, from claiming to be the real birthplace of America, much older than Columbus. Okay, as I say, people like the Vikings. They love their style. But as a historian, I am compelled to puncture certain myths. One of them is that they never actually had horned helmets or winged helmets. And shield maidens, this is another thing. Even the Viking women were warriors. And you saw that actually in the History Channel Vikings. There's a woman who was armed with a shield. She went into battle. These are called shield maidens, and we do dig up Viking graves of women who are buried with weapons. And so this has given rise to the idea that even the Viking women went into battle. But just because you're buried with something doesn't mean you actually used it in real life. That's the key. So people they've questioned the notion of shield maidens, that Viking women did not go into battle. You can be buried with a sword for ceremonial purposes, but it doesn't mean you actually used it. Okay, the real question is, were they that bad? I think they were. I mean, you didn't want to be raided by Vikings. But the real question is whether our sources are somewhat skewed. Okay? As I say, they hit monasteries because monasteries are wealthy and poorly defended. Monks are also literate. And this is one of the biases of history. We are biased towards written sources. So if we are reading written sources, a lot of these have been produced in monasteries. So of course they're going to be complaining quite a lot about the Vikings. So clearly it's an issue for monks, but is it an issue for your average peasant? That's the real question. Probably not, or at least not as much as it would be for a monk. Okay? Peasants don't have much for the Vikings to take, although of course anyone can be the target of a slave raid. So yeah, the Vikings do a great deal of short-term damage across northern Europe. In the medium term, though, they serve to revive trade because they aren't just raiders and thieves. They will do that if they can get away with it, but if they can't, they will happily trade with you. So the Vikings did serve to stimulate the economy, and their cities became places for trade, for buying low and selling high. And as you can see in Ireland or in Russia, they actually found cities. But everywhere, apart from Iceland, over the long run, all of the Vikings ended up being absorbed into the populations wherever they settled. So I always like showing this. It's a deep thought by Jack Handey. When the age of the Vikings came to a close, they must have sensed it. Probably they gathered together one evening, slapped each other in the back, and said, "Hey, good job." And with that, we end our talk about the Vikings.